Hello, and welcome to Nightfall Royals. Tonight, we drift gently back through the corridors of time to meet a king whose name still whispers through history, Henry VIII. Let your body soften, let your breath grow slow, and come with me into a world of candlelight and quiet chambers. Henry VIII was born at Greenwich Palace on the 28th of June, 1491, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. On that warm summer morning, the Thames sparkled in the early light. Few could have imagined that this infant would grow to become one of history's most transformative monarchs. The palace bells rang out across the river, their bronze voices announcing the arrival of a prince who would one day hold the fate of England in his powerful hands. The birth took place in the Queen's apartments, those sumptuous chambers overlooking the river where generations of royal children would draw their first breath. Elizabeth of York, herself the daughter of Edward IV, had endured a difficult pregnancy, but the arrival of a healthy son brought immense relief to the royal household. The infant's lusty cries echoed through the corridors where courtiers waited anxiously for news of the succession. Henry Tudor, the child's father, was one of the last surviving heirs of the House of Lancaster, one of two powerful medieval royal families who had fought over the throne for generations during the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII had seized the throne at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, defeating Richard III in combat and ending the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England since 1154. The Tudor claim to the throne was tenuous, built upon conquest rather than unquestionable hereditary right. The new dynasty was still fragile, sustained primarily by Henry VII's remarkable political acumen and careful financial management. Every royal birth was therefore crucial to the continuation of Tudor rule. Arthur, the heir apparent, born in 1486, had been named deliberately to evoke memories of the legendary British king, while the new Prince Henry was named for his father, cementing the Tudor identity. Young Henry entered a world where his very existence was both blessing and burden. As the second son, he represented what courtiers discreetly called the spare, insurance for the dynasty should anything befall his elder brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, in those uncertain times when infant mortality claimed even royal children with frightening regularity. Every prince was precious beyond measure to the continuation of the bloodline. The infant's robust health was noted with relief by court physicians. Contemporary accounts describe a beautiful baby with a reddish gold hair that would become his trademark, inherited from his Yorkist grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville. His bright blue eyes and fair complexion marked him as distinctly different from his darker, more Celtic-featured father. From his earliest days, Henry displayed the physical vigor that would characterize his youth and young manhood. Elizabeth of York, Henry's mother, brought crucial legitimacy to the Tudor claim through her unassailable Yorkist lineage. As the eldest daughter of Edward IV, she represented the legitimate succession of the House of York. Henry VII's marriage to her had been a political masterstroke, uniting the warring houses and symbolically healing the wounds of civil war. Their children embodied the hope that England's long period of dynastic conflict had finally ended. The christening of Prince Henry took place in the Chapel Royal at Greenwich, with elaborate ceremony befitting a Tudor prince. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the sacred rites, while the greatest nobles of the realm stood as witnesses to the continuation of the royal line. The infant wore robes of cloth of gold, and the christening cup was crafted from precious metals donated by grateful subjects. Henry's early childhood was spent primarily at Eltham Palace, that magnificent red brick residence that Henry VII had extensively renovated for his family's use. Here, away from the more formal atmosphere of Westminster and the Tower. The young prince could develop naturally while receiving the finest education available to any European royal. The palace's great hall, with its magnificent hammer-beam roof, would echo with the sounds of royal children at play. The nursery establishment at Eltham was elaborate and carefully organized. Henry's wet nurse was chosen from among the most respectable women in the kingdom, while his rockers, yeomen, and grooms of the chamber were selected for their absolute loyalty to the Tudor cause. Many of these servants had served Elizabeth of York during her own youth, creating continuity between generations of royal service. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, he displayed signs of the intelligence and charisma that would define his reign. Contemporary accounts speak of a bright, energetic child who charmed all who met him. His laughter rang through the palace corridors like silver bells, and already he possessed that magnetic presence that would later captivate courtiers and foreign ambassadors alike. The young prince's daily routine was carefully structured to balance learning, physical development, and appropriate recreation. He rose early each morning, attended chapel services suitable for his age, spent hours in carefully supervised play that was designed to develop both his physical and mental capabilities. Even his toys were chosen to prepare him for his future role as a great lord of the realm. Henry's first formal lessons began when he was barely 4 years old, under the supervision of carefully chosen tutors who understood that they were shaping not just a prince, but potentially a future king. His quick mind absorbed lessons in reading, writing, and basic arithmetic with remarkable ease. His tutors noted his exceptional memory and his ability to concentrate for periods unusual in such a young child. The royal siblings, Arthur, Henry, Margaret, and Mary, were educated together when possible, creating bonds that would influence their adult relationships. Henry particularly adored his sisters, and the affection was mutual. Margaret, who would later become Queen of Scotland, often protected her younger brother from their tutors' more demanding expectations, while little Mary looked up to Henry with obvious hero worship. Physical development was considered equally important to intellectual growth. Henry learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, sitting confidently on gentle ponies chosen specifically for royal children. His natural athleticism was evident even in these early years, and he showed particular enthusiasm for games that involved competition and physical skill. The political education of a future king began subtly in these early years. Henry observed court ceremonies and gradually learned to recognize the great nobles who served his father. He was taught the proper forms of address for different ranks of society and began to, then, understand the complex web of relationships that bound the aristocracy to the crown. Music entered Henry's life during this period as well, beginning with simple exposure to the court musicians who entertained the royal family. His ear for melody and rhythm was noted early, and small instruments were provided for his amusement. The foundation was being laid for what would become one of his greatest personal accomplishments. Religious instruction formed another crucial component of Henry's early education. He was raised in the traditional Catholic faith of his ancestors, learning prayers and basic catechism from chaplains who served the royal household. The irony that this devoutly raised child would later break with Rome entirely could never have been anticipated by his religious instructors. The death of his brother Arthur in 1502 transformed Henry's life completely, though the 11-year-old prince may not have immediately grasped the full implications of his changed circumstances. No longer the second son with a supporting role to play, he was now heir to the throne of England. The weight of expectation that settled upon his young shoulders would influence every aspect of his development from that moment forward. As this first chapter of Henry's story draws to a close, let us rest in the knowledge that even the greatest oaks begin as tender saplings. In the peaceful gardens of Eltham Palace, where peacocks wandered among manicured hedges and the Thames flowed gently past ancient walls, a future king was taking his first steps toward a destiny that would reshape England forever. Close your eyes now and drift with the gentle rhythm of history's turning pages, knowing that greatness often begins in the simplest moments of childhood wonder. The year 1502 brought profound change to young Henry's life, when tragedy struck the royal family with devastating suddenness. His elder brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, died unexpectedly at Ludlow Castle on April 2nd, just months after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. 10 years old, Henry could not fully comprehend the magnitude of this loss, but he would carry its consequences for the rest of his life. In one terrible moment, he had transformed from the spare heir into the future King of England. Arthur's death sent shockwaves through the Tudor court and beyond. The young Prince of Wales had been the embodiment of his father's dynastic hopes, carefully groomed for kingship and strategically married to cement the alliance with Spain. Sudden passing left Henry VII devastated and forced a complete reconceptualization of young Henry's future. The boy who had been destined for a supporting role in his brother's reign must now be prepared to rule alone. The transformation required an immediate and comprehensive restructuring of Henry's education and preparation. Once he had been groomed for a supporting role, perhaps as a duke commanding armies or managing territories. Now he must master the full spectrum of kingly duties. The weight of expectations settled upon his young shoulders like an invisible crown, carried with growing awareness as he matured into adolescence. John Skelton, Poet Laureate of England, became Henry's primary tutor in these crucial years. A scholar of considerable reputation and a poet of genuine talent, Skelton brought to his royal pupil not merely academic instruction, but a deep appreciation for the power and beauty of language. Under Skelton's patient guidance, Henry mastered Latin with such fluency that he could compose in that ancient tongue with elegance and precision. The study of classical authors formed a cornerstone of Henry's education. He read extensively in Cicero, whose rhetoric would influence his own speaking style, and in Virgil, whose poetry awakened in the young prince a lifelong appreciation for literary excellence. The works of Caesar, Livy, and Tacitus provided him with examples of leadership and statecraft drawn from the greatest civilization of antiquity. French language instruction was equally important, given the complex relationship between England and France that had shaped European politics for centuries. Henry's French tutor, a scholar from the University of Paris, assured that the prince could converse fluently with foreign ambassadors and read the sophisticated French literature that was influencing educated society throughout Europe. Spanish lessons took on particular significance following Arthur's death, as Henry might potentially inherit his brother's Spanish bride along with the throne. The political implications of this possibility were not lost on Henry's tutors, who ensured he could communicate effectively with Catherine of Aragon and understand the culture of her native land. The curriculum designed for the future king was remarkably comprehensive, reflecting the Renaissance ideal of the complete, educated gentleman. Henry studied theology with learned churchmen who guided him through the complexities of Catholic doctrine and church history. Philosophy introduced him to the great questions that had occupied human minds since antiquity, while astronomy opened his understanding to the ordered cosmos that Renaissance thinkers saw as reflecting divine wisdom. Geometry and mathematics received particular attention, as these subjects had practical applications in architecture, engineering, and military science. Henry's mathematical abilities impressed his tutors, who noted his quick grasp of complex calculations and his interest in applying theoretical knowledge to practical problems. This mathematical foundation would serve him well in later military campaigns and architectural projects. Music became one of Henry's greatest passions during these formative years, developing from childhood interest into genuine expertise. He learned to play the lute with considerable skill, mastering both simple ballads and complex polyphonic compositions. The harpsichord yielded its secrets to his nimble fingers, while the recorder allowed him to explore the melodic possibilities of wind instruments. His musical education extended beyond mere performance to include composition and music theory. Henry studied the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony, understanding how mathematical ratios created the consonances and dissonances that gave music its emotional power. This theoretical knowledge informed his own compositional efforts, which began during his teenage years. The Royal Chapel provided Henry with exposure to the finest sacred music of his time. He listened to polyphonic masses by contemporary composers and learned to appreciate the intricate relationship between musical structure and religious meaning. This musical liturgy would influence his own sacred compositions and deepen his understanding of the relationship between earthly beauty and divine worship. Physical education formed an equally important component of Henry's development. He excelled at jousting, that most aristocratic of medieval sports that combined horsemanship, martial skill, and chivalric display. His natural athleticism and competitive spirit made him a formidable opponent, even in practice sessions with experienced knights. Swordplay instruction began with wooden practice weapons and gradually progressed to real steel as Henry's strength and skill developed. He learned not only the techniques of combat, but also the code of honor that governed knightly behavior. His instructors emphasized that physical prowess must always be tempered by courtesy and justice. Archery, that most English of martial arts, received particular attention in Henry's military education. He practiced daily with the famous English longbow, developing the strength and accuracy that had made English archers legendary throughout Europe. This skill would serve him well in his later military campaigns and hunting expeditions. The hunt occupied a central place in Henry's physical and social education. Royal hunting parties were elaborate affairs that combined recreation with political networking and military training. Henry learned to track deer through ancient forests, to read the subtle signs that revealed the presence of game, and to coordinate complex group activities that required both leadership and cooperation. Dancing instruction was considered essential for any Renaissance prince. Henry learned the intricate steps of court dances that were performed at diplomatic receptions and royal celebrations. His natural grace and rhythm made him an accomplished dancer, a skill that would serve him well in the elaborate ceremonial life of his court. The study of statecraft began subtly during these years, as Henry observed his father's methods of governance and gradually learned the principles that guided successful monarchy. Henry VII was a masterful politician who had stabilized England through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and sound financial management. His son absorbed these lessons while developing his own ideas about how a king should rule. Diplomatic skills were developed through exposure to foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries. Henry learned to read the subtle signals that characterized international relations, to understand the competing interests that drove European politics, and to present himself as a worthy representative of English power and culture. The study of law introduced Henry to the complex legal traditions that governed English society. He learned about the common law that had developed over centuries of judicial precedent, as well as the civil law traditions that influenced European jurisprudence. This legal education would prove crucial when he later sought to justify his break with Rome. Historical studies provided Henry with examples of successful and unsuccessful kingship drawn from English and European experience. He studied the reign of Edward III, whose military victories had enhanced English prestige, and learned from the failures of Richard II, whose political miscalculations had led to deposition and death. Religious instruction deepened as Henry matured, moving beyond basic catechism to serious theological study. He read the works of church fathers like Augustine and Aquinas, developing the theological sophistication that would later enable him to engage and learn debate with the greatest religious minds of his time. His early commitment to Catholic orthodoxy was genuine and profound. The development of Henry's character during these years revealed traits that would define his entire reign. He was generous and affectionate with those he favored, but could display surprising coldness toward those who failed to meet his expectations. His charm was legendary, even in youth, but it was coupled with a determination to prevail that sometimes alarmed his advisors. Intellectual curiosity characterized Henry's approach to learning during this period. He asked probing questions that revealed both his intelligence and his unwillingness to accept simple answers to complex problems. His tutors noted his ability to synthesize information from different sources and to apply theoretical knowledge to practical situations. The prince's relationship with his parents during these years was marked by genuine affection, tempered by formal respect. Henry VII recognized his son's abilities while worrying about his sometimes impetuous nature. Elizabeth of York doted on her surviving son while ensuring that his education included the courtly graces that would make him an effective ruler. Court life during Henry's adolescence provided him with practical experience in managing the complex personalities and competing interests that characterize royal households. He learned to navigate the subtle hierarchies of precedence and preference that governed court society, while developing the social skills that would make him an effective leader of men. The influence of Renaissance humanism became increasingly apparent in Henry's education as he entered his late teens. His tutors introduced him to the works of Erasmus and other humanist scholars, who emphasized the importance of combining classical learning with Christian virtue. This intellectual movement would profoundly influence his understanding of kingship and his approach to religious questions. By 1509, when Henry VII died and the 18-year-old prince became King Henry VIII, his education was complete. He had mastered the languages, arts, and sciences considered essential for enlightened rulership. More importantly, he had developed the confidence and sense of purpose that would enable him to transform England from a peripheral European kingdom into a major European power. As young Henry's mind and character take final shape in these pivotal years, we see the careful cultivation of talents and abilities that would soon flower into one of history's most remarkable reigns. Cana and the quiet study chambers where candlelight flickered over ancient texts, and in the practice yards where steel rang against steel, a king was being forged, one who would wield both sword and pen with equal determination. Rest now in the gentle rhythm of learning and growth, and let these scenes of scholarly dedication and youthful promise carry you toward the peaceful sleep that restores both body and spirit. Henry VIII ascended to the throne in 1509 at the age of 17. Following his father's death on April 21st, the young king's coronation marked the beginning of what many hoped would be a golden age for England. After the careful, sometimes austere reign of Henry VII, the realm was ready for a monarch who embodied the Renaissance ideals of magnificence and cultural achievement. The transformation from prince to king was swift and dramatic, for Henry VII had been cautious with the royal treasury. His son immediately demonstrated a very different approach to kingship. The new Henry VIII believed that a king should dazzle his subjects and foreign visitors alike with displays of wealth and power. The court blossomed with pageantry, tournaments, and elaborate ceremonies that showcased England's prosperity and the young king's charismatic leadership. He married Catherine of Aragon shortly after his accession in 1509. This marriage, to his late brother's widow, had been arranged by his father as part of a diplomatic alliance with Spain. Catherine was several years older than Henry and had been living in England since her first marriage to Arthur in 1501. The young king appears to have been genuinely fond of his new queen, and their early married life was marked by apparent happiness and mutual respect. The wedding itself was a celebration that set the tone for Henry's reign. The ceremony at Greenwich Palace was magnificent, followed by days of feasting, dancing, and tournaments. Henry participated enthusiastically in the jousts, demonstrating the physical prowess that had been developing since his youth. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in glowing terms about the young English king's abilities and the splendor of his court. In these early years, Henry governed with the assistance of his father's trusted advisors, gradually learning the practical aspects of kingship. He showed particular interest in military matters and foreign policy, areas where his education and natural inclinations aligned. The young king was eager to establish England as a major European power, equal to France and Spain in prestige and influence. The first major military adventure of Henry's reign came in 1513, when he personally led an expedition to France. This campaign allowed him to fulfill his romantic notions of warrior kingship, while also pursuing his father's policy of maintaining the balance of power in Europe. For 6 months in 1513, Catherine served as regent of England while Henry was in France. Her capable administration during his absence demonstrated the wisdom of their partnership and her own considerable abilities. During that time, the English defeated a Scottish invasion at the Battle of Flodden, an event in which Catherine played an important part with an emotional speech about courage and patriotism. While Henry won modest victories in France, the more significant triumph occurred at home under Catherine's regency. The Battle of Flodden resulted in the death of James IV of Scotland and effectively removed the Scottish threat for a generation. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a flowering of culture and learning at the English court. The king's own scholarly interests encouraged the development of Renaissance humanism in England. Scholars, artists, and musicians flocked to a court that valued intellectual achievement as highly as military prowess. Henry's physical presence dominated these early court gatherings. Contemporary accounts consistently describe him as exceptionally tall and athletic, with a commanding presence that made him the center of attention in any room. His skill at dancing, music, sports made him the ideal Renaissance prince. Cultured, yet martial, intellectual, yet charismatic. The king's relationship with his subjects during this period was characterized by mutual affection and respect. Henry made frequent public appearances, and his obvious enjoyment of royal ceremonial appealed to people who appreciated spectacle and grandeur. Unlike his father, who had been somewhat remote from his subjects, Henry actively cultivated popularity through public displays of royal magnificence. Foreign policy in these early years focused primarily on England's traditional rivalry with France and alliance with Spain. Henry's marriage to Catherine strengthened ties with her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, while his military intervention in France demonstrated England's commitment to maintaining European balance. The young king reveled in the complex diplomatic dance of Renaissance politics. The court itself became a center of learning and artistic achievement during this period. Henry established what would become one of Europe's finest royal libraries, collecting manuscripts and printed books from across the continent. Musicians and composers flourished under royal patronage. Kay and the king's own musical compositions began to circulate among European courts. Perhaps most importantly, these early years saw Henry developing the confidence and sense of purpose that would characterize his entire reign. He had inherited a stable kingdom and a full treasury from his father, Kay, and he used these advantages to establish himself as one of Europe's most important monarchs. The foundations were being laid for the momentous changes that would define his later years. In these shining early years of Henry's reign, we witness the flowering of a young king's dreams and ambitions. The realm prospered under his energetic leadership, and the future seemed bright with promise. As these golden moments fade into the gentle mists of memory, let their warmth carry you into peaceful rest. As Henry's reign matured beyond its golden youth, the question that would ultimately consume his later years and reshape England forever began to cast its long shadow over the royal court. Despite the apparent happiness and mutual affection that had characterized the early years of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, their union had failed to produce the male heir that 16th century political wisdom deemed absolutely essential for dynastic stability and national security. The royal couple's reproductive struggles were a source of profound anguish for both Henry and Catherine, involving multiple pregnancies that ended in heartbreak. Catherine had conceived numerous times between 1510 and 1518, but most of these pregnancies resulted in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infants who lived only a few days or weeks. The pattern of loss was devastating for parents who understood that their personal tragedy had enormous political implications for the future of the Tudor dynasty. Their daughter, Mary, born on February 18, 1516, survived to adulthood and brought great joy to both parents. But her gender meant she could not fully resolve the succession crisis. While there were historical precedents for female rule in England, they were not encouraging. The civil war, known as the Anarchy in the 12th century, had resulted partly from disputes over Matilda's claim to the throne. Henry's own legitimacy ultimately rested on his victory over Richard III, and he feared that a disputed succession might plunge England back into the civil conflicts that had plagued the 15th century. By the early 1520s, it had become increasingly clear that Catherine, now in her late 30s, was unlikely to bear additional children. The Queen's advancing age and the pattern of unsuccessful pregnancies suggested that the couple must accept that Mary would be their only surviving child. This realization forced Henry to confront the possibility that the Tudor dynasty might end with his death, leaving England vulnerable to the dynastic conflicts that had characterized the Wars of the Roses. Into this atmosphere of dynastic anxiety and personal disappointment came Anne Boleyn, a young woman whose intelligence, wit, and sophisticated continental education captivated the king and ultimately changed the course of English history. Anne had been born around 1501, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, successful diplomat and courtier who would later become Earl of Wiltshire. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, connected the family to one of England's most powerful noble houses. Anne's education had been unusually sophisticated for a woman of her time, including extended periods at the courts of the Netherlands and France, where she acquired the polish, languages, and cultural refinement that distinguish her from most English courtiers. Her time at the French court, in particular, had exposed her to the sophisticated literary and intellectual culture that surrounded Francis I, while also introducing her to religious ideas that questioned traditional Catholic authority. She returned to England in early 1522, initially to arrange a marriage with her Irish cousin James Butler that would resolve a property dispute between their families. When these marriage negotiations collapsed, Anne secured a position as maid of honor to Catherine of Aragon, a post that brought her into daily contact with the royal family and established her as a prominent figure in court society. Anne's presence at court marked the beginning of what would become known as the King's Great Matter, Henry's ultimately successful attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine and Mary. And this was not simply a matter of personal preference or romantic passion. Henry genuinely believed, or convinced himself to believe, that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God, and that divine displeasure explained their failure to produce surviving male heirs. The king's theological reasoning was based primarily on a passage in Leviticus 20:21 that seemed to forbid marriage between a man and his brother's widow. And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Henry interpreted this biblical prohibition as explaining why his marriage had been cursed with the deaths of so many children, leaving him with only a daughter. This interpretation conveniently ignored the contradictory passage in Deuteronomy 25:5 that actually commanded such marriages under certain circumstances. But Henry's selective biblical scholarship served his political and personal needs. He convinced himself that the papal dispensation that had originally permitted his marriage to Catherine had been invalid because it had attempted to override divine law, making his marriage null and void from its inception. The process of seeking an annulment began officially in 1527, when Henry instructed his secretary, William Knight, to approach Pope Clement VII for a declaration that the marriage had never been valid. This request placed the Pope in an impossible political position, caught between Henry's demands and the interests of Catherine's nephew. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, whose army had recently sacked Rome, and who was unlikely to accept any decision that dishonored his aunt. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, worked tirelessly to find a solution that would satisfy both the king and the Pope. Understanding that his own position depended entirely on his ability to secure the annulment, Wolsey's efforts included complex negotiations with European powers, attempts to convene ecclesiastical courts in England with sufficient authority to hear the case, and elaborate diplomatic schemes designed to free the Pope from imperial pressure. The failure of these efforts led inexorably to Wolsey's downfall in 1529, when Henry's patience with papal delays finally expired. The cardinal, who had served as the most powerful man in England for over a decade, was stripped of his government offices and died in 1530 while traveling to London to face charges of treason. His replacement as Lord Chancellor, Sir Thomas More, was a man of unquestioned integrity, but also a committed Catholic who would prove unwilling to support Henry's break with Rome. The years of uncertainty took an enormous toll on all involved. Catherine maintained her position with quiet dignity, consistently refusing to accept that her marriage was invalid and insisting that she had come too. Henry, as a virgin, despite her brief first marriage to Arthur, her steadfast refusal to cooperate with annulment proceedings forced Henry to seek increasingly dramatic solutions to his marital dilemma. Anne Boleyn found herself in the uncomfortable position of being courted by a married king whose divorce seemed perpetually delayed. Henry's passionate letters to her during this period, which survive in the Vatican archives, reveal the genuine intensity of his feelings while also demonstrating his growing frustration with papal obstinacy. Anne's own letters, unfortunately lost, apparently encouraged Henry's theological and legal arguments against papal authority. The development of Henry's case against papal supremacy during this period drew on a growing body of scholarly opinion that questioned the Pope's authority over temporal monarchs. English scholars and lawyers researched historical precedents for royal authority over ecclesiastical matters, gradually building the intellectual foundation for what would become the English Reformation. These academic arguments provided respectable cover for what might otherwise have appeared to be purely personal and political considerations. The influence of Protestant ideas, which was spreading throughout Europe following Martin Luther's challenge to Catholic authority in 1517, provided additional ammunition for Henry's cause. While the king initially opposed Lutheran theology and had written a treatise defending Catholic doctrine that earned him the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X in 1521, the practical necessities of his situation gradually pushed him toward acceptance of some Protestant principles, particularly regarding papal authority. Parliamentary involvement in the marriage question began in 1529 with the summoning of what would become known as the Reformation Parliament. Over the next 7 years, this body would pass the legislation that legally separated England from Roman Catholic authority and established the king as supreme head of the English Church. The process began with relatively modest steps designed to pressure the Pope into granting the annulment, but escalated into complete religious revolution. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, passed in 1533, declared that England was an empire unto itself, complete and perfect, with no superior authority on earth. This legislation effectively cut England's legal ties with Rome by prohibiting appeals to papal courts, making it possible for English ecclesiastical courts to decide the king's marriage case without reference to papal authority. By early 1533, Henry's patience with papal delays had completely expired. In January of that year, he secretly married Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant with the future Elizabeth I. This decisive action marked the point of no return in its conflict with Rome and set in motion the legal and religious changes that would establish the Church of England with the monarch as its supreme head. The formal annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine was pronounced by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in May 1533, despite the fact that the Pope had explicitly forbidden any English court to decide the matter. This defiance of papal authority was unprecedented in English history and effectively completed England's break with Roman Catholicism, though the full implications of this separation would not become clear for several more years. Catherine of Aragon's final years were spent in increasingly isolated circumstances, as Henry distanced himself from his first wife and sought to minimize her influence on their daughter, Mary, despite pressure to accept the annulment and take the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. Catherine maintained until her death in 1536 that she was Henry's only legitimate wife and England's true queen. Her dignity in defeat earned widespread sympathy and enhanced her reputation for sanctity. As these momentous events unfold in the shadows of royal chambers and the councils of learned men, we witness how personal desires and dynastic necessities can reshape the destiny of nations. The quiet determination of one king's heart would echo through centuries, changing not only his own fate, but that of all who would follow. Let these weighty matters settle into the peaceful stillness of night, and allow the eternal rhythms of human longing and ambition to carry you gently toward rest. Henry VIII, the king who changed England forever. The story of Henry's 6 wives has captivated imaginations for centuries. Yet, behind the famous rhyme "divorced," beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, lie complex human stories of love, ambition, tragedy, and survival that reveal as much about the changing nature of Henry's character as they do about the women who shared his throne. Each marriage reflected not only the king's personal desires, but also the evolving political, religious, and dynastic pressures of his increasingly complex reign. Anne Boleyn's brief reign as queen was marked by both extraordinary triumph and devastating tragedy, encompassing the heights of political influence and the depths of royal displeasure that characterized life at the Tudor court. Anne gave birth to Princess Elizabeth on September 7, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, the same location where Henry himself had been born 42 years earlier. Though the child was female rather than the male heir Henry desperately desired, Elizabeth's birth represented a personal victory for Anne and seemed to validate the king's decision to break with Rome. The disappointment over Elizabeth's gender was tempered by the infant's obvious health and intelligence, qualities that were immediately apparent to contemporary observers. Henry initially accepted his daughter with good grace, understanding that Anne was young and likely to bear additional children. The elaborate christening ceremony at Greenwich demonstrated royal commitment to the new princess while maintaining hope for future sons. Anne's influence during her brief queenship extended far beyond the royal bedchamber into matters of state policy and religious reform. She was an educated woman with strong Protestant sympathies who had been exposed to reformist ideas during her years at the French court. Her encouragement of Henry's break with Rome went beyond mere personal advantage to encompass genuine theological conviction and political understanding of the implications of religious change. Her court became a center for Renaissance learning and religious reform, attracting scholars and theologians who had played crucial roles in shaping the English Reformation. Anne's patronage of reformist preachers and her support for English translations of Scripture demonstrated her commitment to religious change while providing intellectual justification for the king's actions. Her personal library included works by leading Protestant theologians, and she actively promoted their ideas within court circles. The downfall of Anne Boleyn came with shocking suddenness in 1536. When Henry became convinced of her adultery and treason. Modern historians generally regard the charges against her as fabricated, but they served Henry's immediate political needs, as his affections had already transferred to Jane Seymour. Anne was executed on May 19, 1536, beheaded by a specially imported French swordsman rather than the standard English executioner with his axe, a detail that may have reflected either Henry's residual affection for his second wife or his desire to ensure a quick, clean death. The speed of Anne's fall from favor demonstrated Henry's capacity for ruthlessness when his interests demanded it. The woman who had inspired him to transform English Christianity was destroyed within weeks of her arrest, victim of a judicial process that prioritized royal convenience over legal evidence. Her execution marked a brutal turning point in Henry's character, revealing his willingness to destroy even those closest to him when they no longer served his purposes. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, represented a deliberate return to more traditional queenly virtues after the controversies surrounding Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had been vivacious, politically engaged, and intellectually ambitious, Jane was portrayed as gentle, submissive, and focused primarily on her domestic role as wife and potential mother. Henry and Jane were married on May 30, 1536, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution in the Queen's Closet at Whitehall Palace. The speed of Henry's remarriage after Anne's death shocked many contemporaries and revealed the king's urgent need to move beyond the controversies of his second marriage while quickly securing the succession through a new wife. Jane's background as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn meant she understood court life and royal expectations, while her family's moderate Protestant sympathies aligned with Henry's evolving religious policies. Jane's primary historical achievement was providing Henry with his long-desired male heir. When Prince Edward was born on October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, the birth of a son seemed to validate Henry's entire controversial marital and religious policy, providing the dynasty with its essential male succession while demonstrating divine approval for the king's actions. The elaborate celebrations that followed Edward's birth reflected not only parental joy, but national relief that the succession was finally secured. Tragically, Jane Seymour died just 12 days after giving birth, succumbing to puerperal sepsis and other complications that claimed so many women in that era. Her death genuinely devastated Henry, who regarded her as his only true wife and requested to be buried beside her at Windsor Castle when his own time came. The king's grief was profound and lasting, and he never again seemed to find the same contentment in marriage that he had briefly experienced with Jane. Jane's death plunged the court into mourning, while creating an immediate problem of royal remarriage. Henry now had his male heir, but Edward was an infant whose survival could not be guaranteed in an age of high child mortality. The king's own health was beginning to decline, making the question of remarriage both personally difficult and politically necessary. The search for a fourth wife would be conducted as a matter of state diplomacy rather than personal preference. The extended negotiations for Henry's fourth marriage demonstrated the international implications of royal matrimony in Renaissance Europe. Thomas Cromwell, who had replaced Thomas Wolsey as the king's chief minister, advocated an alliance with the Protestant German states through marriage to Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves, and a potential ally against Catholic powers. The marriage treaty signed in 1539 reflected England's diplomatic isolation following the break with Rome and the need for Protestant allies. Anne of Cleves arrived in England in December 1539 for a marriage that would prove disastrous from the very beginning. Henry's first meeting with his fourth wife at Rochester revealed his immediate physical revulsion. He complained that a portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger had deceived him about her appearance. The king's reaction demonstrated both his personal vanity and his increasing tendency to blame others for decisions that proved unsatisfactory. The marriage ceremony on January 6, 1540, proceeded despite Henry's private reservations, because the international situation made the German alliance politically necessary. However, the union was never consummated, and Henry began seeking grounds for annulment almost immediately. His treatment of Anne during their brief marriage was cold and distant, though he maintained the public courtesies required by diplomatic necessity. The annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was accomplished with surprising ease in July 1540. Based on the king's claim that he had never consented to the marriage and that Anne had been previously contracted to marry elsewhere, and wisely accepted the annulment without resistance, receiving generous financial provisions and several royal residences in exchange for her cooperation. Her pragmatic approach to an impossible situation allowed her to live comfortably in England for the rest of her life. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, represented both the king's attempt to recapture his youth and a fundamental misunderstanding of the dangers inherent in royal marriage. Catherine was probably born around 1521, making her roughly 20 years old when she caught Henry's attention in 1540. Her youth and beauty temporarily rejuvenated the aging king, But her lack of political sophistication and previous romantic entanglements would ultimately prove fatal. Catherine was a member of the powerful Howard family, niece to Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, one of England's premier Catholic nobles. Her elevation to queenship reflected both Henry's personal infatuation and the political influence of conservative court factions, who hoped to reverse some of the religious changes of the previous decade. Her marriage to the king on July 28, 1540, was celebrated privately, without the elaborate ceremonies that had marked his previous weddings. The young queen's brief period of happiness lasted approximately 18 months, during which she seemed to provide Henry with the companionship and affection he craved in his increasingly difficult later years. Contemporary accounts describe a vivacious young woman who enjoyed dancing, fine clothes, and the other pleasures of court life, while bringing to the aging king a sense of renewed vitality and optimism about the future. The discovery of Catherine's previous relationships and alleged continued adultery led to her arrest in November 1541 and her execution on February 13, 1542. The charges against her included relationships with Henry Mannix, her music teacher, and Francis Derham, a gentleman of her grandmother's household, both occurring before her marriage to the king. More seriously, she was accused of adultery with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, after becoming queen. The legal proceedings against Catherine Howard revealed Henry's increasing paranoia and his willingness to interpret any concealment of past relationships as treason. The act of attainder passed against her made it treasonous for any woman to marry the king without revealing her sexual history. Legislation that demonstrated Henry's determination to avoid future embarrassments. Catherine's execution, carried out when she was barely 21 years old, marked the nadir of Henry's treatment of his wives. Catherine Parr, the final queen, brought stability, intellectual companionship, and genuine care to Henry's last years while successfully navigating the treacherous waters of court politics that had destroyed her predecessors. Born around 1512, Catherine was an educated woman with Protestant sympathies who had been twice widowed before her. Marriage to Henry on July 12, 1543, at Hampton Court Palace. Catherine's previous marriages had provided her with experience in managing household affairs and dealing with difficult men, skills that proved invaluable in her relationship with the increasingly unpredictable king. Her intelligence and tact allowed her to provide Henry with intellectual stimulation, while avoiding the political controversies that had endangered earlier queens. Her genuine interest in religious and scholarly questions created a meeting of minds that supplemented their more conventional marital relationship. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine Parr successfully navigated her role as stepmother to Henry's children from his previous marriages, helping to reconcile them with their father and ensuring their restoration to the line of succession. Her influence helped maintain family harmony during a period when dynastic concerns were paramount, while her genuine affection for Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth created bonds that would influence their adult relationships. Catherine's own religious writings, particularly her prayers or meditations, and the Lamentations of a Sinner, demonstrated her intellectual abilities while reflecting the continuing evolution of English Protestantism under royal guidance. Her publications made her the first English queen to publish books under her own name, establishing her as a significant figure in the development of English religious literature. The queen's ability to manage Henry's increasingly difficult personality during his final years reflected both her personal strength and her sophisticated understanding of royal psychology. She provided care and comfort to a man whose physical ailments and emotional troubles made him increasingly challenging to live with, while maintaining her own safety and that of her step-daughter through careful attention to political currents. Catherine Parr's survival of Henry's reign, unlike two of her predecessors, demonstrated her superior political skills and perhaps also reflected the king's own recognition that his marital experiments had caused sufficient disruption. Her continued influence over royal policy in the king's final years helped ensure a smoother transition to Edward VI's reign, while her relationships with Mary and Elizabeth would prove significant during their own later reigns as queen. The pattern of Henry's marriages reveals a fascinating evolution in both his personal character and his understanding of royal matrimony. The romantic young king who had genuinely loved Catherine of Aragon became the calculating monarch who could order the execution of two wives, while maintaining that his actions served the greater good of the realm. Each marriage reflected changing political circumstances while revealing different aspects of Henry's complex personality. The religious implications of Henry's various marriages extended far beyond personal relationships to influence the development of English Christianity. His break with Rome originated in marital difficulties, while subsequent marriages reflected and influenced the changing religious orientation of his reign. The children from these various unions would each rule England in turn, their different religious orientations reflecting the complex theological legacy of their father's marital history. In these tales of love and loss, ambition and tragedy, we glimpse the human heart behind the crown and see how even the most powerful must face the universal experiences of hope, disappointment, and mortality. 6 women shared the throne of England with the king, whose needs grew ever more complex and demanding as the years passed. As their stories fade into the gentle darkness of history, let their memory remind us that behind every crown lies a human soul, susceptible to the same longings and fears that touch us all. Sleep now, and dream of quieter times when love might flourish without the weight of kingdoms upon it. The religious transformation of England during Henry's reign represents one of the most profound changes in the nation's history. What began as a personal quest for marital freedom evolved into a complete restructuring of English Christianity that would influence the country for centuries to come. Henry's original title of Defender of the Faith had been granted by Pope Leo X in 1521 in recognition of the king's written defense of Catholic doctrine against Martin Luther's reforms. The irony that this same defender would later break with Rome entirely demonstrates how dramatically circumstances and personal needs could reshape even the most deeply held convictions. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1534, formally established Henry as the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This legislation represented a revolutionary break with over 1,000 years of English religious tradition. No longer would the Pope in Rome hold ultimate authority over English religious matters. That power now resided with the King at Westminster. The practical implications of this change were enormous. Monasteries that had existed for centuries were dissolved, their vast wealth flowing into royal coffers. Ancient religious houses that had been centers of learning, charity, and spiritual life were closed forever. The landscape of England was physically transformed as monastic buildings were demolished or converted to secular use. Thomas Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, became the primary architect of England's new religious settlement. Under his guidance, English Christianity began to develop its own distinctive character, influenced by both Catholic tradition and Protestant reform. The creation of the Book of Common Prayer and the authorization of an English Bible marked crucial steps in this evolution. Henry's approach to religious reform was characteristically pragmatic. While he rejected papal authority, he maintained many traditional Catholic doctrines and practices. This middle path satisfied neither committed Catholics nor enthusiastic Protestants, but it reflected the king's desire to control religious change rather than be controlled by it. The human cost of religious revolution was substantial. Thomas More, Henry's former friend and Lord Chancellor, was executed in 1535 for refusing to acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, suffered the same fate. These executions of respected intellectuals and churchmen demonstrated Henry's willingness to use extreme measures to enforce his religious policies. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 represented the most serious challenge to Henry's religious reforms. This popular uprising in northern England combined religious grievances with economic and social complaints, threatening to undo the king's achievements. Henry's brutal suppression of the rebellion, including the execution of its leaders, despite promises of pardon, revealed the ruthless determination behind his religious policies. He established the Church of England, creating an institution that would become central to English national identity. This new church retained much of the structure and ceremony of Catholicism, while placing ultimate authority in royal rather than papal hands. The compromised nature of the Anglican settlement would influence English religious life for generations. The king's personal religious beliefs during this period remain somewhat mysterious. He seems to have genuinely believed in his own authority over the English Church, while maintaining essentially Catholic theological views. This combination of traditional doctrine with revolutionary church government created a uniquely English form of Christianity. Educational and cultural changes accompany the religious transformation. The dissolution of monasteries disrupted traditional centers of learning, but royal patronage supported new forms of scholarship and artistic expression. The English language gained new prominence in religious services, literature, and official documents. Economic implications of religious reform were equally significant. The wealth confiscated from dissolved monasteries provided Henry with resources for military campaigns and court magnificence. However, the destruction of monastic charitable institutions created social problems that would persist long after Henry's death. The printing press played a crucial role in spreading religious change throughout England. English Bibles, prayer books, and religious treatises could now be produced quickly and distributed widely. This technological revolution supported the theological revolution by making religious ideas accessible to ordinary people. Foreign relations were inevitably affected by England's religious transformation. Catholic powers like France and Spain viewed Henry's break with Rome as both heretical and potentially threatening to their own stability. Protestant German states, conversely, saw England as a potential ally against Catholic Habsburg power. By the end of Henry's reign, England had established itself as a unique religious entity in European Christendom, neither fully Catholic nor thoroughly Protestant. The Church of England represented a distinctively English solution to the religious upheavals of the 16th century. As these momentous changes sweep across England like morning mist across ancient hills, we witness how one man's will could reshape the spiritual life of an entire nation. The bells that once called faithful Catholics to prayer now rang for a new form of English Christianity. In this transformation of sacred and secular, let us find the gentle rhythm that carries troubled souls toward peaceful rest. The last years of Henry VIII's reign were marked by the gradual, inexorable decline of the once magnificent king who had dominated European politics for nearly 4 decades. The athletic young monarch who had once excelled at jousting, dancing, and all forms of physical activity had become increasingly corpulent and immobile, suffering from painful ulcers on his legs that may have been symptoms of diabetes, osteomyelitis, or other chronic conditions that 16th century medicine could neither properly diagnose nor effectively treat. Henry's transformation from the golden prince of his youth into the bloated, irascible tyrant of his final years represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how power, age, and illness can corrupt even the most promising character. The king, who had once charmed European courts with his wit and athleticism, now inspired fear and revulsion among those forced to attend him. His personality, warped by pain, disappointment, and the absolute power that had gradually isolated him from normal human relationships. Physical deterioration had been evident for several years before Henry's death, accelerating after a serious jousting accident in January 1536. That may have contributed to both his declining health and the personality changes that characterized his later years. The accident occurred during a tournament at Greenwich Palace, when Henry, then 44 years old, and past his physical prime, was thrown from his heavily armored horse and lay unconscious for several hours. Contemporary accounts suggest that this incident marked the beginning of the chronic leg problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. The king's increasing weight became legendary even during his lifetime, with his final suit of armor revealing a waist measurement of approximately 54 inches. This extreme obesity placed enormous stress on his already damaged legs, while contributing to the other health problems that made his final years increasingly miserable. Court physicians were helpless to provide effective treatment, sorting to primitive remedies and bloodletting that probably worsened rather than improved his condition. Despite his physical ailments, Henry remained mentally alert and politically active until very near the end of his life, continuing to involve himself in the details of government, policy, and foreign relations, even when he could barely walk without assistance. His marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 provided him with companionship and intellectual stimulation during these difficult years, while her diplomatic skills helped smooth relationships with his children and courtiers, who had learned to fear his unpredictable temper. Catherine Parr proved to be not only a caring wife, but also a diplomatic stepmother to Henry's children, helping to maintain family harmony during a period of potential dynastic instability. Her influence was particularly important in Henry's relationships with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had been declared illegitimate during their father's various marital controversies, but whose support might prove crucial during any succession crisis. The question of succession dominated Henry's final years, as the king worked desperately to ensure a smooth transition of power following his death. Having finally achieved his long-desired male heir in Prince Edward, Henry was determined that nothing should threaten the Tudor dynasty he had sacrificed so much to preserve. The Third Succession Act of 1544 established the order of inheritance. Edward would be followed by Mary, then Elizabeth, despite questions about the legitimacy of both daughters based on Henry's previous marriage annulments. This succession settlement represented a remarkable compromise between dynastic necessity and personal prejudice, acknowledging that both of Henry's surviving daughters might be needed to preserve the Tudor line while maintaining the fiction that their births had been illegitimate. The king's willingness to restore his daughters to the succession demonstrated both his political pragmatism and his genuine paternal affection. Despite the controversies surrounding their mothers, the creation of a regency council to govern during Edward's minority occupied much of Henry's attention during his final months. Understanding that a child king would be vulnerable to the ambitions of powerful nobles, Henry attempted to create a balanced council that could maintain stability while protecting his son's interests. The complex arrangements he established reflected both his political sophistication and his awareness that his own dominating personality had left few men with the experience and authority necessary to govern effectively in his absence. Foreign policy during Henry's final years focused primarily on the ongoing conflicts with Scotland and France that had characterized much of his reign. His victory over the Scots at the Battle of Solway Moss in November 1542 demonstrated that English military power remained formidable. But the costs of continued warfare strained the royal treasury and diverted resources from domestic concerns. The king's determination to marry his son Edward to the infant Mary Queen of Scots led to renewed conflict with Scotland's French allies, prolonging hostilities that would burden his successors. The conservative religious reaction of Henry's later years reflected both his personal theological inclinations and the political necessities created by his break with Rome. While he never restored papal authority or returned confiscated monastic properties, King moved away from the more radical Protestant reforms that had characterized the middle period of his reign. The Six Articles Act of 1539 had already reasserted traditional Catholic doctrines, while the persecution of Protestant radicals demonstrated Henry's determination to control religious change rather than allow it to develop independently. Court life during this period was shadowed by the king's increasingly unpredictable temperament and his willingness to destroy even trusted servants who fell from favor. The execution of Thomas Cromwell in 1540, despite his loyal service in implementing Henry's religious policies, demonstrated that no one was safe from royal displeasure. Courtiers learned to navigate carefully around a monarch whose favor could turn to deadly enmity with frightening speed, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that affected all aspects of government. The execution of Catherine Howard in 1542 provided another, devastating example of Henry's capacity for ruthlessness when he felt personally betrayed. The young queen's death, when she was barely 21 years old, shocked even a court that had become accustomed to royal brutality. The speed with which Henry moved from infatuation to murderous rage revealed the psychological instability that characterized his final years. Henry's cultural and intellectual interests remained strong despite his physical decline, as he continued to compose music, study theology, and engage in learned discussions with scholars and courtiers. His personal library grew to become one of the finest in Europe, reflecting both his genuine love of learning and his desire to project an image of royal magnificence, even as his body failed him. The king's continued patronage of artists and musicians helped maintain England's cultural reputation during a period when political instability might otherwise have discouraged artistic achievement. The economic pressures that mounted as Henry's reign progressed created problems that would challenge his successors for decades. The wealth gained from dissolved monasteries had been largely spent on military campaigns, court expenses, and building projects, while currency debasement and increased taxation strained the relationship between crown and subjects. The king's financial legacy would prove as problematic as his religious and political innovations. The preparation of Henry's will occupied much of his attention during his final months, as he sought to provide for the succession while maintaining the religious and political settlement he had created. The document he finally signed reflected his awareness that England would face difficult transitions after his death, requiring careful balance between different court factions and religious interests. His provision for his daughter's eventual succession demonstrated both political wisdom and paternal affection. Personal relationships during these final years were few but significant. Limited largely to Catherine Parr and a small circle of trusted servants who had learned to manage the king's difficult personality. Catherine's influence extended beyond the domestic sphere to include religious and educational matters. As her published religious writings reflected the continuing evolution of English Protestantism under royal guidance. Her survival of Henry's reign, unlike two of her predecessors, demonstrated superior political skills and perhaps also reflected the king's own recognition that his marital experiments had caused sufficient disruption. The king's relationship with his children during this period was complex, combining genuine paternal affection with the political calculations necessary to preserve dynastic stability. His pride in Prince Edward was obvious, though he worried about the boy's youth and the challenges he would face as king. His reconciliation with Mary and Elizabeth demonstrated both political wisdom and emotional growth. As he moved beyond the anger and disappointment that had characterized his treatment of them during their mother's disgrace, Henry VIII died at the Palace of Whitehall in the early hours of January 28, 1547, surrounded by his closest advisors and attended by Archbishop Cranmer, who administered the last rites of the church Henry had created. Contemporary accounts describe a peaceful death, though the king's final hours were marked by the same determination to control events that had characterized his entire reign. Hay's death was kept secret for 3 days while arrangements were made for the succession of his 9-year-old son, demonstrating the continued importance of careful political management even in the moment of royal mortality. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed both the stability and the fragility of the system he had created. The Regency Council he had established functioned effectively in managing the initial transition, but the balance of power he had tried to create soon collapsed, as different factions competed for control of the young king. The religious settlement he had established would continue to evolve under his successors, moving first toward more radical Protestantism under Edward VI, then back toward Catholicism under Mary I, before finally settling into the moderate Anglicanism that would characterize Elizabeth I's reign. In these twilight years of a remarkable reign, we witness the gradual fading of earthly power and the approach of that great mystery that awaits us all. Even the mightiest kings must yield 2 times gentle but inexorable passage, their achievements outliving their mortal frames. As Henry's story draws toward its earthly close, we see both the triumphs and tragedies that mark every human life, magnified by the weight of a crown, but fundamentally similar to our own struggles with aging, illness, and mortality. Let the weight of years and the peace of final acceptance carry you into restful slumber, knowing that every story, however grand, must find its ending in the quiet peace that comes to all. The legacy of Henry VIII extends far beyond the sensational stories of his marriages and executions that have captured popular imagination for centuries. His reign fundamentally altered the trajectory of English history, creating institutions, precedents, and cultural changes that would influence the nation's development for generations to come. The England that emerged from his 38-year reign was unrecognizably different from the medieval kingdom he had inherited as an 18-year-old prince. Transformed into an early modern state with distinctive religious, political, and cultural characteristics, the establishment of the Church of England represents perhaps Henry's most enduring and significant achievement, creating an institution that will become central to English national identity and provide a model for Anglican churches throughout the world. What began as a desperate solution to his personal marital difficulties evolved into a distinctive form of Christianity that occupied a unique position between Catholicism and Protestantism, characterized by episcopal structure, liturgical tradition, and theological moderation. The Anglican settlement that emerged from Henry's reign, while not fully realized until Elizabeth I's time, established principles that would define English Christianity for centuries. The via media, or middle way, between Rome and Geneva reflected Henry's own pragmatic approach to religious questions, while providing sufficient flexibility to accommodate both Catholic and Protestant sympathies within a single national church. This ecclesiastical compromise would prove remarkably durable, surviving civil wars, revolutions, and cultural changes while maintaining its essential character. The constitutional implications of Henry's religious revolution extended far beyond immediate ecclesiastical concerns. 2. Influenced the fundamental relationship between monarch and parliament in English governance. While Henry dramatically increased royal authority over religious matters, he achieved this transformation through parliamentary legislation rather than royal decree, inadvertently strengthening parliamentary sovereignty even as he enhanced royal power. This paradoxical development would prove crucial in later constitutional conflicts. The Reformation Parliament that sat intermittently from 1529 to 1536 established important precedents for legislative supremacy in matters of both religious and civil governance. Complex legislation that implemented Henry's break with Rome required unprecedented cooperation between Crown and Parliament, demonstrating that even the most revolutionary changes could be accomplished through established constitutional processes. These precedents would influence English constitutional development long after the immediate religious questions had been resolved. The economic transformation brought about by the dissolution of the monasteries created lasting changes in English social structure and land ownership patterns. The redistribution of approximately 1/3 of all cultivated land in England from ecclesiastical to secular ownership represented the largest transfer of property since the Norman conquest, creating new classes of landowners while destroying traditional feudal relationships that had characterized medieval society. The beneficiaries of monastic property sales included not only established noble families, but also merchants, lawyers, and other members of the emerging middle class who used their commercial profits to purchase landed estates. This expansion of the landowning class created a broader social base for political participation, while strengthening the connection between property ownership and political authority that would characterize English society for centuries. However, the destruction of monastic charitable institutions created social problems that persisted long after Henry's death. Traditional sources of poor relief, medical care, and education disappeared without adequate secular replacements. The social dislocation caused by these changes contributed to the economic and political instability that would challenge Henry's immediate successors, while the long-term effects influenced English social policy well into the modern era. The cultural achievements of Henry's reign, while sometimes overshadowed by political and religious controversies, established England as a significant center of Renaissance learning and artistic achievement. The king's personal accomplishments as a musician and composer, combined with his patronage of scholars, artists, and writers, helped transform England from a cultural backwater into a nation that could compete with Italy and France in intellectual and artistic achievement. Henry's own musical compositions, including the famous Pastime with Good Company and numerous other secular and sacred works, demonstrated a sophistication that impressed contemporary European courts while influencing the development of English musical tradition. His court musicians, including composers like Hugh Aston and Robert Fairfax, created works that reflected both continental influences and distinctive English characteristics, contributing to a flowering of musical achievement that would continue under his successors. The expansion of educational opportunities during Henry's reign. Despite the disruption caused by monastic dissolution, laid foundations for the intellectual achievements of later Tudor and Stuart periods. The establishment of new grammar schools, the refundation of cathedral schools, and the transformation of university education all contributed to rising literacy rates and the development of a more educated populace capable of participating in the religious and political debates that would characterize subsequent reigns. The Royal Navy, established during Henry's reign, provided the foundation for England's later maritime dominance, reflecting his understanding that an island nation required strong naval defenses to maintain independence and protect commercial interests. The construction of purpose-built warships, the development of naval artillery, and the creation of permanent naval installations represented lasting contributions to English military capability that would prove crucial in later conflicts with Spain and France. Henry's naval innovations included not only the construction of larger and more heavily armed vessels, but also the development of new tactical approaches to naval warfare that emphasized firepower over boarding actions. The Mary Rose, which sank in 1545 during a battle with the French fleet, exemplified these innovations while demonstrating the risks associated with experimental naval technology. The ship's recent archaeological recovery has provided unprecedented insights into Tudor naval life and technology. The legal precedents established during Henry's reign influenced English jurisprudence for centuries, particularly in areas relating to royal prerogative, parliamentary authority, and the relationship between ecclesiastical and civil law. The complex legislation that implemented the English Reformation created new categories of legal reasoning, while establishing principles that would guide subsequent legal development. The treason laws expanded during Henry's reign, particularly those relating to words and intentions, as well as actions, remained influential long after the immediate political circumstances that created them had passed. While these laws were often criticized for their severity, they established important precedents regarding the relationship between individual conscience and state authority that would influence later debates about religious and political freedom. Administrative reforms introduced during Henry's reign improved the efficiency of royal government, while creating institutional structures that would serve English monarchs for generations. The establishment of new governmental departments, the systematization of record-keeping, and the professionalization of civil service all contributed to the development of a more effective state apparatus capable of implementing complex policies throughout the realm. The Court of Augmentations was created to administer the wealth confiscated from dissolved monasteries, exemplified these administrative improvements while demonstrating Henry's attention to bureaucratic detail. This institution not only managed the immediate transfer of monastic property, but also established procedures for ongoing administration of crown lands that would influence royal finances for decades. International diplomacy during Henry's reign elevated England's position in European affairs while establishing patterns of foreign policy that would characterize English international relations for centuries. His skillful maneuvering between the major European powers demonstrated that England could maintain independence while pursuing aggressive policies toward neighboring kingdoms, providing a model for later English foreign policy. The marriage alliances, military interventions, and diplomatic initiatives of Henry's reign established England as a significant player in European politics, despite the nation's relatively small population and limited resources. This achievement reflected both Henry's personal diplomatic skills and the effectiveness of the governmental and military institutions he had created or strengthened during his reign. The three children who survived Henry to adulthood would each rule England in turn, bringing their own interpretations to their father's complex legacy while demonstrating its lasting influence on English political and religious development. Edward VI, Protestant Reformation, Mary I, Catholic Restoration, and Elizabeth I's final Anglican settlement, all built upon the institutional foundations established during Henry's reign, while revealing different aspects of his multifaceted legacy. The religious diversity of Henry's children's reigns reflects the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of his own religious policies, as each monarch emphasized different elements of their father's theological and ecclesiastical legacy. This diversity ultimately strengthened English Christianity by demonstrating the flexibility and adaptability of the religious settlement Henry had created, even as it caused considerable instability during the mid-16th century. The architectural legacy of Henry's reign included the construction and renovation of numerous palaces, castles, and fortifications that would influence English building traditions for generations. Hampton Court Palace, extensively rebuilt during his reign, demonstrated the possibilities of Renaissance architecture adapted to English conditions while providing a model for subsequent royal and aristocratic building projects. The coastal defense system constructed during Henry's reign, including elaborate fortifications at Portsmouth, Dover, and other strategic locations, represented a significant investment in national security while demonstrating the application of continental military engineering to English defensive needs. These fortifications remained militarily significant well into the modern era while influencing the development of English military architecture. The economic policies implemented during Henry's reign, while often criticized for their short-term focus and inflationary effects, established important precedents for royal fiscal management while demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of early modern state finance. The systematic exploitation of monastic wealth, the expansion of customs duties, and the manipulation of currency all provided models for subsequent financial policies. The long-term economic effects of Henry's policies included both positive and negative consequences that would influence English economic development for centuries. The redistribution of monastic lands contributed to agricultural improvement and commercial development, while the destruction of traditional charitable institutions created social problems that required new governmental responses. The cultural impact of Henry's reign extended throughout English society, as the religious, political, and social changes he implemented influenced literature, art, music, and popular culture in ways that would persist long after his death. The emergence of a distinctive English national consciousness, separate from both continental European and traditional medieval identities, represented one of the most significant cultural achievements of his reign. The English language itself was transformed during Henry's reign through the increasing use of vernacular, rather than Latin, in religious, legal, and governmental contexts. The production of English Bibles, prayer books, and official documents contributed to the standardization and enrichment of the language, while making it a more effective vehicle for national communication and cultural expression. The printing industry that flourished during Henry's reign played a crucial role in disseminating new ideas while creating the technological infrastructure necessary for the intellectual and cultural developments of subsequent periods. The production of books in English rather than Latin reflected changing cultural priorities while making learning more accessible to ordinary people. Modern historical assessment of Henry VIII acknowledges both his remarkable achievements and his significant moral failures, recognizing his role in transforming England from a medieval kingdom into an early modern state, while condemning his use of execution as a political tool and his callous treatment of several of his wives. This balanced evaluation reflects the complexity of his character and the mixed nature of his historical legacy. The continuing fascination with Henry VIII in popular culture demonstrates the enduring power of his story and its continuing relevance to contemporary audiences interested in questions of power, personality, and historical change. From Shakespeare's plays to modern novels, films, and television productions, Henry's larger-than-life personality continues to captivate new generations while providing insights into the human dimensions of political authority. The institutional changes implemented during Henry's reign proved remarkably durable, surviving civil wars, political revolutions, and cultural transformations while adapting to changing circumstances. The Church of England, despite various modifications over the centuries, retained the basic structure established during the English Reformation, while the constitutional precedents created during his reign continued to influence English governmental development. The global influence of Henry's legacy extended far beyond England's borders as English colonization and cultural influence spread Anglican Christianity, English legal traditions, and English governmental institutions throughout the world. The Anglican Communion that emerged from Henry's religious revolution eventually encompassed churches in dozens of countries, while English constitutional principles influence governmental development in numerous nations. As we contemplate the vast sweep of Henry's influence across the centuries, come to understand that few monarchs have left such complex and enduring legacies upon the world. His reign transformed not only England, but the very nature of kingship itself, creating precedents and institutions that would guide the nation through triumph and trial for generations uncounted. In the gentle twilight of this remarkable story, we see how one man's will, shaped by circumstances both personal and political, reshaped the destiny of millions yet unborn. Let the weight of history settle softly around you like a comfortable blanket, carrying you toward the peaceful rest that awaits all earthly journeys, knowing that even the mightiest kings are remembered not only for their power, but for their humanity. Good night.